Hello everyone, this will be the second chapter of A Second Life by Die Earl Connigan 6083 and read by Insect Overlord. Time didn't really mean anything to Danny. He knew how to read a clock, but he didn't really know what a day was, so what did that matter? Also, since they were in space, there wasn't really a 24-hour day. He knew that the International Space Station experienced 16 sunrises and sunsets a day due to the speed they were traveling around the Earth. But that had to be the old dimension, his old home. Who knew how fast the Watchtower was going? Maybe it experienced more, or less. Nightwing would know. He felt a sort of familial bond with the man coming from his chest. Perhaps he recognized him somehow? Even though Danny didn't have any memories, Nightwing had been spending a lot of time with him, helping him strengthen the muscles throughout his body. Due to his help, Danny was able to walk on his own now and eat without spilling everywhere. It felt great to be more independent. The people on the Watchtower were incredibly kind to him, generally always willing to answer his questions. There was always someone around, watching him though. Danny didn't know about that. He also hadn't really told anyone that he was called Danny. He wasn't sure if that was what he wanted to be called in this new life. That was the whole point, right? The whole reason his other self had crossed dimensions. To let himself be someone new. Someone else. But he kind of liked the name. It felt right. It was hilarious to hear all the nicknames that the assorted heroes came up with. Bud, Buddy, and Kiddo were among the most common ones used. A tall, strong-looking lady in some super cool armor with a glowing golden rope at her hip, who had introduced herself as Diana, liked to call him a little one. She was really fun, but probably pretty important, since she had only visited once, even though he could tell she liked him. Batman visited often and would call him Chum, which was really weird. He was pretty sure Chum was a fish, or the bait used to attract fish? He wasn't really sure why Batman called him that. Though he had heard Batman call Nightwing and Robin Chum, so maybe that was a Batman thing. He didn't know, but it was kind of weird. It brought the word Fruit Loop to mind, but he also felt that Batman had done nothing to deserve that severe of an insult. Yet, at the same time, it was a cereal, and not an insult. His memory was a little bit wonky. He remembered nothing before the time he woke up on the Watchtower. At least, he didn't think he did. Danny also hadn't really tried to recall anything from before he'd woken up here. From what he could hear from the others' whispers of Cadmus, it wasn't a great place. It was probably a good thing he couldn't remember it. He only recalled his other life through dreams, and not so much of it. It had only been repeats of what he had seen before, if he even dreamed of his previous life. Honestly, Danny was kinda okay with that. Without these memories, he was free to just be himself, whoever that was. And Danny wanted to explore. He wanted to play, and he wanted to get off the Watchtower. Yes, he loved space, but he was starting to feel really cooped up. He hadn't been let out of his room he'd woken up in. He really hated it. He glanced at his current babysitter, the green-skinned lady, Miss Martian. She wasn't paying that much attention to him, reading through something on one of those tablets. She'd given him some paper and crayons and told him to draw. Danny had for a while, but he was bored now. He wanted to see Nightwing. He always felt happier, safer, when the man was around. The heroes all seemed to live here on the Watchtower, so he just had to sneak out to find him. Then they could play and hang out, watch more of those Disney movies. Tell Nightwing that he had a name now. Well, he'd had one, just hadn't been sure he'd wanted to keep it yet. He was sure now. So, he was pretty sure what his powers were. He'd known as soon as he'd woken up that he could fly. He also just knew that he could turn invisible and go through walls, shoot these green blasty things from his hands and create shields with the same green stuff. Could also make this green scream thing, although he just instinctively knew it could make him really tired. Oh, and he could make ice. He was pretty sure there were others, but those were the ones he could remember. Turning invisible, he made his way away from the table in his room towards a wall, before going intangible. Outside was a pretty plain hallway. Boring. But he was sure he'd find people if he kept going. From his exploring, Danny learned that his room was in the hospital section of the space station. But man, this place was huge. There was a massive kitchen, which Danny may have taken a few chocolate bars from. He just knew that the Kit Kats and Twix were his favorite, despite the fact he couldn't remember having them before. Danny was pretty sure no one would mind, that no one would miss them. Probably. It seemed one side of the space station was a massive atrium with a bunch of these metal-like caves on the bottom floor. There were people here, arriving in flashes of yellow light from the metal caves. He wandered some more, finding lots and lots of meeting rooms and rooms with computers. Boring. Some of the rooms did have people in them, but he didn't really recognize any of them, so he didn't say hi. Stranger danger and all that. There was a gym, too. He hadn't known there was so much stuff that could be used to work out. Danny may have spent a couple minutes playing with the yoga balls, sitting on them, putting them under his stomach just to roll along the floor, giggling while doing so. His muscles were getting tired. Danny hadn't really walked around this much since he'd woken up. He decided to rest, sitting against the wall and happily eating some of his Kit Kat bars he'd pilfered. As he sat there, an announcement came over the speakers in the ceiling. He had no idea this place had an intercom. Attention, Leaguers. We have a missing child who was liberated from a mission last week. If you spot him, please contact the monitor room. He recognized the voice. Was that Miss Martian? Uh-oh. That was probably for him. He needed to find Nightwing fast. Heck, he would even take Red Hood or Red Robin. They were nice to him. Batman and Diana were tied for fourth. He didn't really want to go back to his room. It was kind of starting to feel like a cell. Exploring had been so much more interesting than being cooped up there, even if a lot of the rooms were boring. Huffing, he stood up, double-checking that he was still invisible. His legs hurt, but hopefully he shouldn't have to go too much farther. Nightwing and his room couldn't be that far away. Danny began to search even more rooms, getting more and more disappointed at each one. He'd found the bedrooms, but they were empty, and he couldn't tell who any of these belonged to. They all looked so bare and dull. Why hadn't anyone painted their room, or put little stars on the ceiling? Danny could feel himself getting annoyed and frustrated. Why was this so hard? He sniffed, feeling tears of frustration start to form. He was really tired, and he'd been searching for what felt like a long time. Was it really that much to ask to find Nightwing? "Bud, you there?" called a man dressed in all blue with red underwear and a red cape. He also had a giant S on his chest. Superman. Superman reached a hand up and pressed it near his ear. "I don't see anything, but I can hear the boy's heartbeat. He's nearby. Yes, it's him. He has a pretty distinct heartbeat," Superman said wryly. Superman could hear his heartbeat? That was pretty cool. What else could he do? Danny sniffed again and wiped at his eyes. "Hey, buddy, what are you doing out here?" Superman asked, crouching down. Danny couldn't help but giggle, since Superman was staring at his invisible chest and not his face, probably looking where he heard Danny's heart. "I'm exploring, looking for Nightwing," Danny said, letting his invisibility drop. "I'm sorry, buddy, but he's not on the Watchtower right now. I can ask when he'll be back. Why don't we go back to your room and wait for him, okay?" Danny frowned. No wonder he couldn't find Nightwing. He wasn't even here. He couldn't help but feel disappointed. "No." "No?" Superman asked, surprised. "No," Danny repeated grumpily. He didn't want to go back to that dumb room. He was bored there. Well, you can't wander the hallways, kiddo, so we have to go somewhere else, 'kay?" Danny eyed the adult. "You can't make me." "Oh, I'm pretty sure Superman cut off as his hand slipped right through Danny. Danny didn't even bother to hide his pleased smile. "No, you can't," he said in a sing-song voice, thrilled by Superman's shocked expression. A mischievous idea popped into his head. "Come find me," he yelled before turning on his heels and running off, phasing through a few walls. Superman would probably keep looking for him, making it a perpetual game of hide-and-seek, where the adult was always seeking and he was always hiding. Perfect. He didn't really want to be the seeker. Danny made his way back to the kitchen and hid under one of the tables, making sure he was invisible once again. He was not going to make it easy for Superman. He was going to have to find Danny the hard way, by listening to his heartbeat. There were 2 people standing at the kitchen counter. One had red and yellow lightning bolts on his head, and a man in green who kind of looked like Robin Hood. They hadn't noticed Danny, as he came through a wall and been invisible at the time. Danny didn't have to wait long before Superman came through the door. "Hey, Supes, what's up? Don't you have monitor duty?" the man in red and yellow asked. "Did you hear the announcement yet? McGann lost the Cadmus kid." "He's not lost, he's just wandered off," Superman responded. His eyes were looking at the table Danny was hiding under. Danny held his breath. Superman's eyes moved over to a different table. Danny breathed a small sigh of relief. Superman then crouched down and looked under it. "Nope, not here," Danny giggled before slapping his hand over his mouth. It was really funny that Superman hadn't found him yet, but he didn't want to give himself away. A smile spread across Superman's face before he made his way to the next couple tables, searching under them, opening up some of the cabinets and a pantry, searching for Danny. Danny kept his hand over his mouth, but they couldn't really hide his giggles and the laughter that was coming from him. He knew that Superman was doing this on purpose, but it was still really hilarious. The red and yellow Boltman and the knockoff Robin Hood had a pretty good idea of where he was, based on the way they were staring at the table Danny was hiding under invisibly. Must not be here. Let me know if you guys see him. Bye, guys," Superman said with a wink at the 2 men before walking out the door. That was not how this was supposed to go. Superman was supposed to keep searching for him till he found Danny. Then Danny would hide again, and Superman would look for him, so on and so forth. Superman wasn't supposed to just leave. Letting his invisibility drop, he stepped out from under the table, keeping an eye on the other 2 people in the room. The Bolt man had his mouth hanging open, and the green hoodie guy looked both annoyed and surprised. Whatever, not important. He had to follow Superman. He approached the door, letting it slide open before he peeked his head out into the hallway. He spotted the blue and red clad man looking into different rooms, unaware of Danny. He huffed before following. Really, he thought Superman had been smart. Had the hero really not known he was under the table with his giggling and his heartbeat? Danny followed the adult hero down different hallways, half curious and half annoyed. They made their way to the main atrium place, not too far from where all those meeting rooms and the medical section was. Danny was a bit more cautious entering the large open space. There were less places for him to hide here. Hesitantly, cautiously, he crept into the open hallway that looked out into the atrium. Where was Superman? He'd just seen him. Where had he gone? "Gotcha!" exclaimed Superman's voice, as 2 large hands grabbed him from under his armpits and lifted him high up in the air, placing him on top of Superman's shoulders. Danny squeaked in surprise, looking down at the person he was now sitting on top of. He hadn't expected that, but it felt nice to sit down. "I thought we were playing hide-and-seek," he asked. "Oh, I'm not so sure about that. Besides, you were cheating," Superman teased. Danny huffed, crossing his arms. "You were too. Listening to people's heartbeats is totally cheating." "Then we were both cheating," Superman said. Danny grumbled, putting his crossed arms on top of the hero's head, then resting his own on his arms. "I guess, but you totally tricked me. You knew where I was the entire time," he accused. "I did," the man admitted, floating out into the open space of the atrium. "But you had fun, didn't you?" "Yeah." They were both silent as Superman floated them down to the bottom of the arch ram, where all the metal caves were. Miss Martian floated in a moment later. "Superman, you found him," she said with relief. Danny squirmed, feeling a bit guilty. He hadn't meant to make her worry that much, honest. He just wanted to get out of that room. "I'm surprised he was able to slip away without you noticing," Superman remarked. She grimaced. "His mental presence can be hard to detect at times. He seems to be adept to hiding his presence." "No kidding. He can turn invisible and density shift, no problem. I guess he has some Martian in him." "I can hear you, you know," Danny reminded them grumpily, pouting from his tall perch. Floating up till she was at eye level with him, Miss Martian opened her arms to grab him. "Why don't we go back to your room, okay, kiddo?" Danny eyed her warily. He didn't want to go back, but he was tired. His exploration mission had wiped him out. Sighing, he let Miss Martian pick him up. "When is Nightwing going to be here?" he asked moodily. He wanted Nightwing to be the first person he told his name to, and he wanted to ask when he was getting out of here. He'd been patient, but he was tired of being cooped up. It wasn't fair. "He's not scheduled to arrive for another 6 hours, she told him placatingly. Danny frowned. 6 hours? That was a long time. But maybe if he napped, then he wouldn't be so tired when Nightwing came. Ancients, he hated that his body was so weak and got tired so easily. He felt like he used to be able to stay up much longer. Not only that, but he hadn't even walked that far, and his legs were tired. "Bye, Superman, and thank you again for finding him," Miss Martian said with a grateful smile as she began to drift away, Danny in her arms. Looking back at the large and beefy man, Danny called, "Bye, Mr. Superman. We should play hide-and-seek again sometime." "Looking forward to it," the hero said with a grin and a wave. They made their way back to the room in the medical wing far too quickly. As soon as he was released, Danny made his way to the bed, hopping up on it. Looking at the female hero, he pondered for a moment, then asked, "You'll wake me up when Nightwing gets here, right?" "Of course." He didn't know if he trusted her. She was a hero, but she was keeping all sorts of things from him, which wasn't cool at all. Danny deserved to know, didn't he? It was about him in the first place. Knowing now that they couldn't really keep him locked up here helped. He could theoretically escape at any time, except for the fact that he was pretty sure he couldn't survive in the vacuum of space, so he had no way off the Watchtower. Those metal caves, though, that people used to teleport in and out, that seemed to be his way out. He'd had to ask Nightwing, though. Although Nightwing was a hero, too. He was part of the reason Danny was confined here, in this room. His innermost self, his very core, trusted the man, said that Nightwing was family and wouldn't hurt him. It vaguely recognized Batman, Red Hood, Red Robin, Spoiler, Orphan, Signal, and Robin as family, too. But it was the strongest for Nightwing. Danny wasn't sure why. Maybe it had to do with his powers, or maybe the previous him, the previous Danny, had watched Nightwing in particular and decided that is who he would hang out with once he crossed dimensions. There were too many questions and no answers. Grumbling, Danny snuggled into his scratchy pillow and let himself drift to sleep. Hopefully, Miss Martian would wake him up, like she said. Danny awoke sometime later to whispering. That hadn't been what woke him up, though. It had been his inner self, his heart saying that Nightwing was here and was upset. So Danny should do something about that. Blinking his eyes, he stayed still, eavesdropping on the conversation happening just feet away. "Telling me he can just density shift? Like it's nothing. I remember that it took you years to learn and perfect. He's tiny. How could he have learned that already?" Came a harsh, frantic whisper. Oh, that was Nightwing. Why was he upset that Danny could phase through stuff, and why were they calling it density shifting? 'Cause that's not what Danny was doing, right? I have no idea. He shouldn't be able to do that. But we've had trouble figuring out, well, what different species he's made up of, and from who specifically. Although the density shifting, along with the invisibility and floating, and the ability to hide from mine and Uncle John's minds, makes me think he's definitely part Martian. Miss Martian whispered softly. This sucks. We find him in Cadmus' lab. Our preliminary scan of him and the files we were able to salvage told us he's made from some of my DNA, but we can't figure out who the other donors are. Nightwing sighed deeply. Trying to be as quiet as possible, Danny sat up. Nightwing was sitting on one of the hard plastic chairs, his head buried in his hands. So, he was made from Nightwing, like a kid or a clone? His mind whispered. Danny frowned. Why did he feel like he knew a lot about clones? They tended to not be stable and didn't always end up looking like who they were cloned from, especially if the original had powers. Danny looked down at his hands. Why did he know this? Was that because he was a clone? Is that why he was so weak all the time? He wasn't stable? That did explain why he felt such a pull towards Nightwing, though, if Nightwing was his original. But Nightwing had mentioned other donors. Did that mean he was made up from other people, too? Even more mysteries with no answers. There was so much he had to figure out. But first things first, Nightwing was upset, and he didn't like that. Not only that, but Miss Martian had totally lied. She hadn't woken him when Nightwing had arrived. Sliding down from his bed, Danny walked over to the two adults, their heads snapped over to look at him. He hadn't exactly been quiet when he'd gotten off the bed. At least his legs and feet no longer ached. Naps always made all his pain go away. It was like a reset button. Stopping just in front of the man sitting in the chair, he turned to look up at the Martian woman. You said you'd wake me when Nightwing got here. You lied, he accused. Not even bothering to see her reaction, he turned to the man in front of him. Why are you upset? Is it because I'm a clone of sorts? Danny asked, fear and dread gripping his heart. He didn't know what he'd do if the answer was yes. This concludes Chapter 2 of A Second Life. I hope you liked it. I liked that this chapter sort of explained some of Danny's background in this new world. Also, sorry for the change in audio in the middle. I had to switch rooms because the one room that I like to record in that sounds better in is next to a big window, and our neighbors decided it would be a good idea to start mowing their lawn at 11:30 in the morning on a very hot and humid day, which is a very bad idea, which I would know because I wrote a 10-page paper on it for my environmental studies class. It's really bad to mow your lawn just period, but especially during it's when it's really hot out. But anyways, sorry for that rant. The next chapter should be up soon. Thank you so much for listening.